Hello everyone, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Man in the Black Apron. I grew up in a quiet, neatly manicured suburban neighborhood, the kind where every house looks just like the next, where the most exciting thing for a group of kids to do after school was to play outside until the sun dipped behind the rooftops. My sister, who was a year younger than me, and I often joined our neighbors in playing games like knock and run, what some people might call ding-dong ditch. We had our routines, our laughter, and a shared belief that our world was predictable and safe. My friend James lived next door, and his older sister Tay, who was 14 at the time, sometimes played with us too. I suspect her interest was more in my younger sister than in our games, but she was always there, adding to the mix. I'll admit now that I was never the bravest among us. My instinct has always leaned toward flight over fight, and I would find any excuse not to be the one to ring the doorbell. Watching from a safe distance always felt more thrilling than being caught in the act. On one particular afternoon, a few of my cousins came over. One was my age, another a bit younger and not old enough to really participate in our games, and the oldest, Daniel, was a year older than me. He was only 11, but everyone treated him like he was far more mature, almost like a small adult in a kid's body. He's important to this story, and looking back, I think all of us somehow leaned on him for guidance in subtle ways, even though we didn't realize it then. That afternoon, we were all shooed outside to burn off energy and avoid disturbing the adults. We naturally gravitated toward playing knock and run again, but we usually kept to familiar territory, our own street, and maybe the next one over. That day, though, something compelled us to stretch our boundary a bit farther, perhaps emboldened by having Daniel with us. We wandered up the hill to a play park that sat in a grassy space where a house might have been in other neighborhoods, and from there we could cut through to a road we weren't quite as familiar with. As we sat on the swings and slide, laughing and debating who should knock first, a vote was cast, and of course I was chosen. But true to form, I wriggled out of it and convinced Daniel to take my place. He agreed, his usual quiet pride making it impossible for him to back down. Our target was a pristine white marble house at the corner. A house that stood out with its curved driveway and elegant fountain. It had an intimidating presence, one that made it an irresistible dare. I crouched beside a parked car at the edge of the driveway, just small enough to peek beneath it from the curb. From my hiding spot, I had a clear view of Daniel approaching the front door. He rang the bell 3 times, something we did to make sure we were heard, and then darted back down the path. But before he reached the sidewalk, the front door flew open, and an older man stepped out, dressed in a black leather apron stained with what I initially assumed was paint. He was moving faster than I thought anyone his age could, charging down the path with outstretched arms and fury in his eyes. I froze, the scene playing out like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My view was perfect, every detail burned into my memory. The man's skin was leathery, his hair grey and sparse, and there was a twisted urgency in the way he moved. Daniel didn't even realize he was being chased at first, but the second he turned and saw the man gaining on him, he let out a scream that I'll never forget. It was raw, primal, and it shattered the illusion that this was just another silly game. Daniel, proud and composed as he usually was, sounded utterly terrified. The gate at the end of the walkway was waist high, and instead of opening it, he leapt over it in a single motion. That moment may have saved him. The man lost precious seconds fumbling with the latch. As Daniel tore down the street, the man yelled something incomprehensible, his voice booming with anger. The entire neighborhood seemed to pause. It reminded me of those old Western movies where 2 figures face off in the middle of the road, the tension stretched tight like a drawn bow. The man's face was now clearly visible, deep lines etched into his skin, white pants, a white button-up shirt beneath his apron. The red smears on the apron didn't look like paint anymore. He confronted Daniel in the street, shouting in a way that made even the birds seem to stop chirping. I could barely make out what he said, but the words "sick people in there" cut through the air. Then, from across the road, Tay screamed at the man. Her voice was sharp, commanding, and it broke his focus just long enough for Daniel to bolt again, disappearing around a corner. We all scattered, running without a destination, just needing to get away. I ended up in the car park of the shopping centre, sitting among strangers and watching cars come and go, seeking safety in the crowd. I didn't know if the man had chased anyone else or if he had returned home. After what felt like half an hour, I gathered enough courage to return home. When I got there, I learned I was the last to arrive. Daniel had run straight to my house, and Tay had followed. The others had wandered the streets for a while before making their way back. My mum wasn't home, which struck me as odd until I realised she had gone to confront the man herself. My mother is fiercely protective, and while I was glad she was standing up for us, something about the look on her face when she returned unsettled me deeply. Her usual warmth was gone, replaced by a pale, tight-lipped silence. That night, we stayed at my neighbour's house. My mum said she needed to talk to my dad about something important, and though no one said it aloud, we all knew it had to do with what happened. For weeks afterward, we weren't allowed to play knock and run. We weren't allowed to go to the park without a parent. My sister was furious, too young to grasp the gravity of what had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about the man. The speed at which he moved, the look on his face, the strange red stains, it haunted me. Eventually, I asked my mum what he had said when she confronted him. At first, she brushed it off, tried to pretend she didn't remember. But I kept pressing. One evening, she pulled me aside, sat me on my bed and made me promise not to tell anyone. Not my sister, not my cousins, no one who had been there that day. She told me she had gone up the hill and found the man pacing in his driveway like a wind-up toy, going back and forth with mechanical precision. He didn't seem angry anymore, just unsettled. She approached the gate, and as she let herself in, he stopped and stared at her. My mum said the confrontation was heated. He yelled at her for trespassing, and she yelled right back for scaring the kids. But then he said something that made her blood run cold. She wouldn't tell me the exact words, only that he threatened to show her what it felt like to have someone unwanted on your property, and that he would shut those kids up forever. When he reached toward her, she bolted, her instincts kicking in faster than fear. That night changed something in her too. She looked smaller, somehow, like she had glimpsed something she couldn't explain. A month later, things seemed to settle. We started going outside again, always careful, always within sight of an adult. But then something happened that reopened the wound. My dad asked me to go to the shops for bread. It was a short walk across the street. I felt proud to be trusted with the task. I took the $2 coin and made my way across, wandering through the aisles and stopping briefly in the toy section to admire things I couldn't afford. That's when it happened. 2 hands pushed me to the ground. I landed hard on the sticky floor and looked up to see the man from the marble house. He was red-faced and furious, shouting at me in a garbled mess of words. I tried to scramble away, but he kicked my foot out from under me. A staff member heard the commotion and came running, giving me the chance to escape. I ran out of the store, loaf of bread in hand, heart pounding in my throat. When I got home, I told my parents everything. They were horrified and immediately forbade me from going anywhere alone again. But they forgot something. We still had to walk to school. The path to school followed a scenic creek, quiet and secluded. A week later, as my sister and I walked home, we passed an SUV parked along the path. The man was inside. My sister, too young to be wary, started walking toward him. I grabbed her hand and pulled her back. The man's voice changed, bright and cheerful now. "Wait up, I'll walk you home," he said, but something about it was all wrong. I ran, dragging my sister along the creek, heart in my throat. I didn't stop until we crossed over a muddy, dangerous shortcut and emerged onto a different road. We were safe, for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always close, always watching. Story 2. The midnight apartment escape. When I was in high school, my friend Claire came over for a sleepover that didn't quite go as planned. We were two teenage girls, reckless and excited, thinking we were invincible and ready to take on the world without realizing just how fragile that world could become with one wrong decision. We made plans to sneak out that night. Typical rebellious behavior for girls our age. The plan was simple: meet up with some guys, hang out, and then one of them would drive us back before sunrise so our parents wouldn't suspect a thing. We ended up in an apartment complex deep in the city, far from home, laughing and joking as the night wore on. At first, it was exactly what we imagined: music, dim lights, a carefree atmosphere. Midnight crept up on us faster than expected, and we figured it was time to head back, just as we had agreed. But when we asked the guys to give us a ride back, everything shifted. The laughter died. They looked at us with glazed eyes and shrugged. Some said they were too drunk, others said they were too high to drive. Their promises from earlier vanished like smoke in the air, and a strange sense of unease started settling in the pit of my stomach. It was clear that none of them were going to help us get home. At first we were stunned, caught off guard by how easily we'd been dismissed. Then, with no other choice, Claire and I decided we'd walk back toward the entrance to the apartment complex and see if we could call someone to pick us up. The streets were quiet, the sky dark, and our confidence drained with each step we took. We hadn't realized just how far we were from anything familiar until we were already committed to leaving on foot. We had barely made it halfway through the winding parking lot when a car slowly started rolling up behind us. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was young, naive, and still somewhat convinced that nothing truly bad could happen to me. But Claire wasn't as oblivious. She looked over her shoulder and whispered for me to walk faster. I followed her lead, picking up my pace. The car behind us picked up its pace too. That's when she said more urgently, "Start running." Just as we broke into a sprint, the car jerked forward, stopping ahead of us. 2 passenger doors swung open and 2 men stepped out. My blood went cold. It was like every horror movie had come to life right in front of us. There was no time to think, no time to weigh our options. Claire pulled me by the wrist and we ran, adrenaline surging through our legs as we weaved between parked cars in the lot. We ducked behind a pickup truck, trying to catch our breath and praying we hadn't been seen. One of the men, however, hadn't returned to the car. His footsteps echoed across the asphalt, growing louder. We went silent, motionless, holding our breath. He circled the truck, and we mirrored his movement on the other side, playing a terrifying game of cat and mouse. I could hear my heart thudding in my chest, louder than I ever thought possible. We moved slowly, carefully, avoiding detection as he rounded the truck again and again. Somehow, miraculously, he never spotted us. After a few laps, maybe bored or frustrated, he turned and walked back toward the car. We watched as he got in, and the vehicle circled the complex like a predator searching for a meal it had been denied. But they weren't giving up, they just kept circling, over and over. Cold and exhausted, we huddled near the pool house, finding cover behind the fences and overgrown bushes. The winter air bit through our thin clothes. We had dressed to impress, not for survival. Claire found a ragged Captain America blanket abandoned nearby, and we wrapped ourselves in it like armor. I remember shivering not just from the cold, but from the fear. We were calling everyone we could think of, friends, guys from the party, anyone with a car. No one answered. Minutes turned into hours. At some point, the exhaustion set in and the tears began. We felt completely forgotten, alone, vulnerable. But we held on to each other, reassuring ourselves in whispers that someone would come. Someone had to come. The idea of giving up was not even an option. We were just 2 girls in the dark, hiding from something that could have easily ended our lives if it had gone another way. Finally, as the first hints of dawn stretched into the sky, one of our friends answered the phone. They agreed to come pick us up. That small flicker of hope reignited something inside us. But the danger wasn't over. The guys in the car were still there, still circling like vultures. We coordinated with our friend over the phone, asking what buildings were near them, what dumpsters they could see, anything to help us identify their location. We peeked out carefully, making sure the coast was clear. Then we ran. We bolted through the complex like ghosts, barefoot and silent, heading toward our friend's car. The moment we saw it, parked by the entrance, we dove in and screamed, "Go!" Our friend didn't ask questions, just hit the gas. As we sped away, we passed the car that had stalked us. The men inside were watching. We didn't speak much during the ride home. The adrenaline had faded, and all that was left was the heavy fog of disbelief. How had this become our night? We got back around 6 in the morning, just in time to sneak back into my house without my parents ever knowing we had left. The Captain America blanket, that dirty piece of fabric we had found in our most desperate moment, became a strange kind of symbol for us. We washed it, shared custody of it for years, as a reminder of the night we survived. It wasn't just about escaping danger. It was about realizing that we couldn't afford to be so careless with our trust. That night could have ended so differently. If Claire hadn't been with me, I truly believe I wouldn't have made it back. Her quick thinking saved me, and I'll always be grateful for that. It's been years since that night, but it left a mark, a deep one. I'm cautious now, always aware of who's around me, what vehicles are nearby and where every exit is. That night forced me to grow up faster than I ever wanted to. And as for the men who tried to corner 2 teenage girls in the dark, I hope they never found another victim. I hope they live with the knowledge that we got away. Maybe they don't. Maybe we were just another failed attempt, but for us it was everything. We learned that monsters don't always hide under beds. Sometimes they drive slow, dark cars and smile before the chase. We were lucky, and not everyone is. I'll never forget what it felt like to be hunted. And I'll never take a quiet, safe night for granted again. Story 3. The house I never returned to. The house I grew up in was old, one of those places where the floorboards always creaked and the corners seemed to hold more shadow than they should. As a child, I never thought much of it. I was 6 when I first began to sense that something wasn't right, but at the time, I didn't feel fear, just curiosity. I remember being particularly excited when a local vicar came over to speak with my mother. She had been struggling with her mental health and was searching for peace in religion. It was past my bedtime, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hoping they would let me downstairs to meet him. Instead, I lay in my bed, ears tuned to the creaks and groans of our home, and then it happened. The stairs groaned as someone came up, slow and steady. My bedroom door eased open, and the floor creaked as if someone walked across the room, but no one was there. I wasn't imagining it either. My nightlight bathed the room in a soft glow, enough to see clearly. The door opened all the way, and I watched as invisible feet pressed down the wooden floorboards with distinct weight, as though a presence I couldn't see was moving across the space. These occurrences became strangely routine. My bedroom door opening by itself, the sensation of being watched, and sometimes even hearing the soft sound of breathing when no one was near. I never screamed. I never even told my mother. Somehow, I simply accepted it as part of the house. It was eerie, yes, but as a child, I think I convinced myself it wasn't something to fear. That acceptance continued for years until I was 15, until the night everything changed. I was alone in the house, as I often was back then. My dad had moved out long ago, and my stepmother lived just 2 streets over. That night, he was at her place, and I was supposed to be packing up my bedroom. We were getting ready to move. I wasn't packing though, I was watching wrestling on TV, wrapped in the comfort of noise and distraction. Around midnight, I went to bed and opened a magazine, trying to lull myself to sleep. That's when it hit me. A wave of overwhelming fear washed over me like a tidal wave, and I felt nauseous in a way that was far more than physical. My dog and cat, who were both in the room, began acting strange. My dog, usually calm and obedient, began whining hysterically and barking at an empty corner. She even peed on the floor, something she had never done before. My cat pressed her face against the curtain, crying softly. I knew then that something was watching us, something that my animals could see even though I couldn't. and somehow I could feel it too, this thick weight of presence in the room. It settled in the far corner, just out of reach of the light, just beyond comprehension. My limbs felt paralyzed, like I was pinned beneath invisible hands. It took every ounce of courage I had to move. When I did, it was as if I were breaking free from an unseen force. I leapt out of bed and fled the room, never once daring to look back. But I could feel it behind me, something following, just inches from my back. I ran to the front room and grabbed the phone, my hands shaking as I called my dad. I told him he had to come now. I didn't explain. I didn't know how. He heard the panic in my voice and promised to be there soon. As I waited, I opened the front door and stood in the middle of the road. I needed distance from that place. My poor dog was stuck halfway down the stairs, crying as if trapped between two worlds. When my dad finally arrived, he went in to get her. I never set foot in that house again after that night. The next day, my dad tried to talk to me about what had happened, and for the first time, he confessed that he had always hated that house too. He had never told me, not wanting to scare me while we lived there, but he said the upstairs always felt wrong to him. He'd been tripped on the stairs more than once, and even claimed something had grabbed his leg before. That was why he always insisted I hold the banister. It wasn't just for safety, it was for protection. There was something in that house, something neither of us could explain. And then there was the dream. It began not long after we moved out, recurring so often that it became part of my routine. In the dream, I would come home from school, cheerful and light. Everything seemed normal at first. The front room was bathed in warm afternoon sun. But then, as I walked into the kitchen, it grew dark. Rain pounded the windows. A storm had arrived, and I was suddenly outside in the garden, drenched and sobbing uncontrollably. In every version of the dream, I faced away from the house at first, but I could feel something watching me. I always knew exactly where it was, my old bedroom window, facing the garden. The presence was there, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. I would try to turn and look to see what it was. And every time, just as I was about to see the face, I would wake up. It became a part of my life for years, appearing once or twice a month. But 15 years ago, the dream changed. This time I didn't wake up. I turned all the way, and I saw the face. It was the same face I had felt watching me on that last night in the house. The same presence that chased me down the stairs. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, but this time, the face was gone from my memory, like a curtain had fallen the moment I saw it. I never had the dream again after that. I have told this story a few times, but never fully. Not like this. I always leave parts out. Maybe it's fear, maybe it's disbelief, but I know what I experienced, and even though it sounds impossible, I wouldn't wish it on anyone. That house changed something in me. It taught me that there are things we don't understand, things we can't explain. And when you encounter them, the mind does everything it can to protect you. It buries memories, erases faces, smooths over jagged edges. But the feelings, the weight of that fear, the helplessness, they never leave. They sit with you silently, always just behind the veil of daily life, waiting to be remembered. I don't know what lived in that house. I don't know if it was a ghost or something darker, but I do know it was real, and whatever it was, it knew me. It watched me. It stayed with me through childhood, through adolescence and into my adult life. It lingered in dreams, haunted corners of memory, and whispered through the silence. And though I've never gone back, not even once, part of me still feels tethered to that place, like a piece of my soul is trapped there, watching from the window. Every now and then I drive past the street, never daring to slow down. And every now and then, I swear I feel that same weight in my chest, the weight of being seen by something that should not exist. Story 4. The Cemetery Call. Working as a 911 dispatcher in a small Oklahoma police department wasn't something I imagined would ever shake me. I loved the job, loved the structure, the adrenaline, and even the stillness that sometimes settled in the early morning hours when the rest of the town was fast asleep. I had just started working there when this particular night changed how I looked at things. It started off like any other shift. I was sitting with one of my co-workers around 3 a.m., chatting about ghosts. I told him casually that I didn't really believe in all that. He looked at me and smiled in that knowing way, then said 4 words that settled into my chest like a stone. "Oh, you will tonight." I laughed, brushing it off, assuming it was just another creepy joke to pass the time. But then the phone rang. Not just any phone. Our direct 911 landline. It doesn't ring unless there's an emergency. That phone doesn't accept outside calls, and it's not a line that someone can dial accidentally. I answered it, the headset crackling softly as I connected. What I heard next made my skin crawl. There was no voice, no frantic cry for help, just heavy, labored breathing. The kind of breathing that carries weight and presence, like someone or something is standing too close in the dark. I asked if they could hear me. I asked who was calling. No reply, just breath, raspy and distant. The call lasted 43 seconds before cutting off without a word. My co-worker just looked at me, waiting, and then pointed toward the screen where the call's location was pinged. The address lit up in red. An old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place so remote that no one had lived near it for decades. The map system used by our 911 service was notoriously accurate, placing calls within 5 inches of their origin. The phone that had just called us wasn't mobile. It was a landline, and it had come from the very center of that burial ground. I felt a cold chill snake down my spine as my co-worker leaned in and said, "Happens every night." I stared at him in disbelief, thinking surely this was an elaborate joke or some strange test. But he was serious. He explained that the same call comes in almost nightly, sometimes at midnight, sometimes closer to dawn, but always from that cemetery, always with that same breath. The number is always the same too, and when we try to call it back, it's listed as disconnected or unavailable. No service, no home, no explanation. He told me that years ago. They used to send officers out there to check, thinking maybe it was a prankster hiding in the shadows or some forgotten payphone that had never been removed. But there's nothing there. The cemetery is locked, surrounded by a wrought iron gate that creaks with age. And inside, there are only headstones and wild grass. The oldest officer on our team, a gruff man with 23 years under his belt, confirmed the story when I asked him about it the next day. "Every night for as long as I've been here," he said with a shrug. "No one's ever caught anyone. No wires running out that far. We gave up a long time ago." The matter-of-factness in his tone was more unsettling than the call itself. It was like everyone in that room had accepted that the unexplainable was part of their routine. It wasn't an emergency, it was just part of the job. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started waiting for the call each night, hoping to hear something different, hoping maybe it wouldn't happen again. But it did. Night after night, the same call, the same breath, the same silence. It was never earlier than midnight, never later than 4. I recorded the timestamps, watched the patterns, trying to make sense of it, but some things don't want to be understood. What disturbed me most was not just the consistency, but the intent. It didn't feel like someone randomly messing around. It felt deliberate, like something was reaching out, locked in a routine, as if trying to be heard but unable to speak. One night, I stayed on the line a little longer, whispering into the receiver, asking if they were okay, if they needed help. I asked if they were lost, but nothing ever changed. The breath continued, slow and raspy, until the call abruptly ended once again. Afterward, I sat in silence, the phone still in my hand, my heart racing. The idea of a landline calling from a place where no one lives, no one works, no wires run, that alone made no logical sense. And yet there it was, a nightly ritual from the dead center of a forgotten graveyard. I began avoiding walking past that side of the office. I didn't want to be the one to answer anymore, and yet I also couldn't look away. It was as if the cemetery had started to live in my head, taking up space in my dreams. I began dreaming about that breath, the feeling of being watched from beneath the soil. I could see the headstones in my mind at night, hear footsteps crunching on dry leaves even though I was alone. I asked one of the patrol officers to drive me past the cemetery during the day. I needed to see it with my own eyes. We pulled up to the gate and everything was still, just rows of markers and overgrown weeds. But even in the light, there was a weight in the air, an unnatural quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Since then, I read up on the cemetery's history. Apparently, the land was once part of an old army base. Soldiers had been buried there after a sickness swept through the camp, taking dozens at once. Families stopped visiting decades ago. The gates were locked and mostly forgotten. But if you walk near the fence, you'll see strange patterns in the grass, like someone or something walks the same path over and over. One officer claimed he once saw the faint glow of a lantern moving between the stones late at night. Another swore he saw a figure just beyond the gate, watching, but when he blinked it vanished. We don't talk about it much anymore. It's become one of those things everyone knows, but no one discusses. We answer the call, we listen to the breath, we log it, and we move on. I still don't know what it is. Maybe it's a loop, a residual echo of a desperate final call made decades ago. Maybe it's a soul who never got their answer, locked in a pattern they can't break. Or maybe, and this is the thought that chills me most, it's someone trapped there every night, reliving the last breath of their life, trying to make contact from a place where time no longer moves forward. All I know is, I believe now, not because I want to, not because it's comforting, but because I've heard it, I've felt it. And when the phone rings in the middle of the night, and the breath reaches through the receiver like a whisper from the grave, I answer, because someone has to. Story 5. The Man in the Rain. It was just another cold, rainy morning, one of those days when the sky still looks like night, and everything feels a little quieter, a little slower. I had been walking to work for the past 7 months, leaving the house around 6 every morning. My street sat at the edge of the neighborhood, and behind it were thick woods, no houses, no lights, just trees and silence. Over time, I grew used to walking alone. There weren't many others awake that early, and apart from one guy on the next street who sometimes rushed out to his car, it was always just me and the misty darkness. But that morning felt different from the start. The rain was steady, and the cold crept into my clothes with every step. I had just crossed my street when I heard it. A soft rustle, like someone stepping on wet gravel behind me. I turned my head slightly and saw him, an older man, maybe in his late 50s, bundled up in dark, damp clothes, walking just a little too quietly behind me. He hadn't come from a house. It was like he'd emerged from the woods, or had been waiting, just out of sight, for me to leave. He had no umbrella, no backpack, nothing to suggest he was heading to work. He didn't look at me, just stared straight ahead, matching my pace. At first I tried to dismiss it. Maybe he was just taking an early morning walk. Maybe he lived nearby and had a routine like mine. But as I started walking faster, he did too. Each time I picked up my speed, I could hear his footsteps quicken behind me, crunching the wet gravel in rhythm with my own. That's when I reached into my bag and wrapped my fingers around the small pink taser I always carried, just in case. I didn't run, not yet. I kept walking, heart pounding in my chest, eyes scanning the dark street ahead, praying that someone else might step outside, that a car might drive past, that something, anything, might break the silence. But the houses were all still and dark. When I reached the bus stop, I felt relief wash over me. A few other people were already there, 2 men waiting under the shelter. I stepped into the small circle of safety and turned around slowly. He hadn't followed me into the light. He had stopped just before reaching the stop, lingering in the dark like he was waiting for something. I stared at him, trying to memorize every detail of his face, his clothes, the way he stood. But he never moved closer, never said a word. Eventually he turned and walked away into the shadows. I didn't know whether to feel safe or more frightened. Part of me wondered if I had overreacted, if maybe he really had just been walking in the same direction. But another part of me couldn't forget the way he'd matched my steps, how he'd shown up without warning, how he'd vanished just as silently as he'd appeared. The worst part? I had a suspicion about who he was. There was an older man in our neighborhood, someone with a dark history. I had heard whispers growing up, mostly from my parents and their friends, about how he had once been in jail for serious offenses. Assault. Worse. He was known to wander around during the day, making small talk with neighbors, offering to help with yard work. Just last month he had offered to tend to our garden when my dad wasn't home. He had lingered too long near our porch, watching the windows. My mother had brushed him off with a smile, but I'd felt uneasy ever since. It was dark that morning, and I couldn't see clearly enough to confirm that it was him, but something in my gut told me that it was. There was a familiarity to his posture, to the stillness of his body when he stopped walking, to the faint curve of his lips that almost looked like a smile. I didn't tell my parents right away. What was I going to say? That a man may have followed me, that I thought he could be dangerous, that I wasn't even sure if it was who I thought it was. I convinced myself it was over, that it had been a close call, and now I knew to be more careful, to keep my taser in hand, to stay in the light. But the next day, when I stepped outside again at 6 a.m, I couldn't help but glance at the woods, and for a brief second, I thought I saw movement. Something shifting behind the trees, just out of sight. I never stopped walking to work. Life doesn't slow down for fear. But I started changing my route, leaving a little earlier or a little later, taking a different turn each day to keep myself unpredictable. I made small talk with the other regulars at the bus stop. I smiled, even when I didn't want to, hoping that forming those small bonds might offer a layer of protection I couldn't create on my own. And I watched. Every day I watched for that man, for his silhouette, for his shoes stepping too quietly behind mine. But he never showed up again. Not in the woods, not at the stop, not in any of the streets I passed through. He had come and gone like a shadow in the rain, and somehow that made it worse. At least if I saw him, I could prepare myself, but his silence left a hole, a question without an answer, a fear without resolution. There are moments now, even years later, when I still flinch at the sound of footsteps behind me. Sometimes I find myself gripping my bag a little tighter, or reaching for my taser even when I'm surrounded by people. That morning became a lesson I didn't know I needed. A reminder that sometimes danger doesn't come roaring. Sometimes it walks in silence. It waits. It tests your pace. It disappears just when you think. And the scariest part of all is not knowing whether he was ever going to do anything, or if he was just letting me know that he could have, that he was there, that I was seen, and that next time I might not be so lucky. Story 6. The Man Who Watched from the Hill. It was the night of a concert, one I'd been looking forward to for weeks. I was 17 at the time, craving independence more than anything else in the world. My friend and I had worked out a plan. She was taking the tram home afterward, and I told my mother that her parents would be giving me a ride. That was a lie, of course. My mother was strict, and if she knew I planned on making my own way home late at night, she would have never allowed me to go. I thought I had it all figured out. I'd take the tram, walk the rest of the way home, and sneak into the house without anyone noticing. It was a Friday night. I assumed there would be plenty of people on the tram, all heading back to the same general area. I figured I'd have the cover of crowds, the protection of movement. But the moment I stepped off at my stop, I realized how wrong I had been. The tram was nearly empty, just a few passengers, none of whom got off with me. The station was quiet, too quiet. The moment I began walking, I noticed him. A man behind me, just far enough to avoid suspicion, yet close enough to feel deliberate. He wasn't saying anything, just walking. Hood up, face shadowed. I thought maybe he was just heading in the same direction. I lived in a large housing complex after all, and it wouldn't be that strange, but something felt wrong. The air felt charged, like something was watching me. As I walked, I felt the weight of his presence behind me. It wasn't just the sound of his footsteps, it was the rhythm. Matching mine too precisely, adjusting when I did. My gut twisted with unease. Still, I told myself not to panic. I was 5'8", strong for my age, and I had walked this path hundreds of times before. I picked up my pace, hoping to shake the feeling. My music played low through my earphones, but I resisted the urge to turn up the volume. Every instinct told me to stay alert. I tried to convince myself he was just someone getting home from work. But when I reached the entrance to my housing complex and took that sharp turn into my cluster of homes, I dared a glance back. He was still there, closer now. I didn't recognize him, and I knew every face in our cluster. He wasn't from here. I took another turn, heading up the steep hill that led to my specific building. My legs burned, but I didn't slow down. His footsteps got faster, heavier, no longer subtle or careful. He wasn't trying to hide it anymore. He was gaining on me, and I knew in that moment that he wasn't just walking home. He was following me. I was almost at my house, 30 seconds away if I ran, but I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing my panic. I reached into my pocket and clenched my keys tightly, ready to use them as a weapon if I had to. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. I just kept walking, one hand on my bag, the other curled around cold metal. When I reached the last turn, I forced myself to glance one more time. He wasn't moving anymore. He stood at the top of the hill, just staring down at me. His face was mostly in shadow, but the way he watched, motionless, as if committing the moment to memory, froze my blood. He didn't say a word. He didn't come closer. He just stood there, letting me see him, letting me know that he'd been there the whole time. I turned the corner quickly, breath catching in my throat, and raced to my door. Unlocking it with trembling hands, I slipped inside and locked it behind me. I didn't realize I was shaking until I dropped my keys. My parents were home, asleep upstairs, oblivious. I collapsed onto the floor and sat there for a long time, heart pounding, sweat clinging to my skin even though it was a cold night. I never told them what happened. I never told anyone. I buried it, convinced myself that it could have just been a misunderstanding, that maybe he really had lived in the area and was confused by my reaction. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. He had followed me. He had watched me make every turn, adjusted his pace to match mine, and stopped when he knew I would see him. It wasn't random. It was controlled, calculated. And that was the part that haunted me the most. He never needed to say a word to make his intentions clear. For years I pushed the memory down, telling myself it was just a one-time thing, an unlucky moment. But as I got older, I began to recognize it for what it was, a predator testing the waters, seeing how far he could go, seeing how close he could get. I realized that if I had taken even a slightly different route, if I had fumbled my keys a few seconds longer, it might have ended very differently. My house was my only sanctuary that night, and I had barely made it in time. That hill, the one he stood at the top of, remained burned into my memory. Every time I had to walk it again, I felt his presence echoing behind me. I would look up and see nothing, but the image of him watching still lingered like a shadow burned into my mind. Eventually, I stopped walking alone at night altogether. I changed routines, avoided being alone whenever possible. Friends would tease me for being overly cautious, but I never cared. I knew what I had felt. I knew what I had seen, and I would never again let myself be caught off guard. I had seen the darkness in someone's eyes without ever seeing their face. I had felt the quiet intent of someone who didn't need to speak to make a threat. That experience stole a part of my peace, a part of my youthful confidence. It replaced it with vigilance, with awareness. It taught me that danger doesn't always come crashing through windows. Sometimes it walks slowly, patiently, quietly. It follows you home, just far enough to make you question your instincts, just close enough to leave a permanent scar. It's been years now, but sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear footsteps outside. I rush to the window, breath held, eyes scanning the hill. There's never anyone there, but that doesn't mean he's gone. That man never tried to hurt me physically, but what he did that night was worse in some ways. He made me live in the what-ifs. He made the familiar feel foreign. And he made silence the loudest threat I've ever known. And in the deepest part of me, I sometimes wonder if he remembers me, the same way I remember him. If he ever stood on another hill, watching someone else make that last, desperate turn home. Story 7. Screams. From the river. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. My girlfriend and I were staying at her parents' newly purchased riverfront property, tucked away deep in the Olympic Peninsula. The home sat along the Hood Canal, nestled between dense forests, gravel roads, and just enough isolation to make you feel like the world outside had faded away. The first few nights were perfect. Crackling firelight, crisp air, the gentle lull of the river's current audible through the open windows. There were a few other homes scattered sparsely along the road, but each was hidden behind trees, their lights just barely visible through the branches. On the night it happened, everyone had gone to bed after a quiet movie. I stayed awake, scrolling through my phone, the window open next to me, letting in the fresh scent of rain-soaked earth and the rhythmic sound of the river flowing just beyond the trees. That was when I first heard it. A splash. At first, I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon crossing the shallow part of the river. My dog, curled up beside me, lifted his head and growled low, ears pinned back. I sat up a little straighter. The splash came again, closer this time, and then it stopped. Silence returned for a moment before a new sound crept through the window. A cry, low and guttural, somewhere between a bellow and a howl. It didn't sound like any animal I could place. It was too deliberate. There was a pacing quality to it, like it was being repeated on purpose in regular intervals. Then came a sound like heavy huffing, breathing that made the hair on my arms stand on end. My dog began to shake, eyes locked toward the forest. The cry continued, slowly moving from across the river to the right side of the house. Each cry seemed to grow louder and more twisted, as if something wild and primal was learning how to mimic human emotion. I called softly for my girlfriend to wake up, whispering that something wasn't right. She stirred groggily, just in time for us both to hear a distinct scream, louder than before. Help! But the voice wasn't natural. It sounded like someone trying to form the word without fully understanding it. The syllables were garbled, the cadence all wrong, but it was unmistakably human. We sat in the bed, paralyzed, listening to that word, help, echo through the trees again and again, each time more distorted than the last. My girlfriend's eyes met mine, wide with fear. She whispered, "What is that?" We bolted out of bed and rushed to wake her parents. They were groggy and disoriented, but the urgency in our voices got them moving. We turned on every light and locked every window and door. Her father stepped outside briefly with a flashlight, sweeping it over the backyard toward the river, but nothing moved. The cries had stopped. Everything was still. We stayed up the rest of the night, ears straining in the quiet, expecting the screaming to return, but it never did. The morning brought a strange calm, the kind that settles in after a storm, as if the world had decided to pretend nothing had happened. After the sun rose, we went out to walk the property, hoping to find some explanation. But there were no tracks, no signs of animals or people, just damp soil and the bubbling river as peaceful as ever. For days, I replayed the sounds in my mind. I scoured the internet, listening to recordings of animals native to the region: cougars, foxes, owls, elk. None of them matched what we heard. The voice hadn't been animal, and it hadn't been fully human either. It was something in between, something trying to imitate, to lure. I told myself it had to be a person, maybe someone in trouble, maybe someone hurt. But if that were true, why hadn't they come closer? Why had they stayed hidden? And why had the cries sounded so off? It was as if we had heard a performance rather than a plea, like something was testing how human it could sound. We checked with neighbors too, but no one had seen or heard anything. No missing persons, no accidents in the area, just the dark and the sound of water moving through trees. My girlfriend and I began sleeping with the windows shut tight. The open air, which once felt like freedom, now felt like exposure, vulnerability. I started hearing things in the white noise of the fan, jumping at every creak of the wooden walls. My dog refused to go near the back porch, tail tucked between his legs, eyes fixed toward the tree line every night. He had never acted like that before. Her parents insisted we were just spooked, victims of imagination stirred by isolation and a strange sound. But I knew better. I had never heard anything like that scream before, and I pray I never do again. It didn't belong in this world. And the scariest part? It knew how to say our language, or at least it wanted us to think it did. We've been back to the property since. During the day, it's everything you'd hope for in a cabin escape. Sunlight filtering through leaves, the river glistening, the quiet broken only by birdsong. But when night falls, the atmosphere changes. The shadows return, stretching longer than they should. The trees seem to press in, and every time I step outside to get firewood or check the gate, I feel it. That invisible pressure in the air. The sensation of being watched. I don't let myself walk to the edge of the river anymore. I don't want to get too close to the place where we first heard it. I don't want to give it the chance to call out again. Because if it does, I don't know what I'd do. I don't know if I'd be strong enough to stay inside. And maybe that's what it wants. I've wondered in quiet moments whether it was a person at all, whether some entity lives in the woods near that river, using cries for help to bait its prey, waiting for someone kind enough or curious enough to answer. If I'd gone outside that night alone, if I'd stepped into the darkness searching for the source of that voice, would I have come back? Or would I have vanished, pulled into the trees by something that mimics human desperation, just well enough to fool someone like me? I don't know. But I believe something is out there, and every time I hear the word help whispered by the wind or imagined in the rustling leaves, I remember that night. I remember the voice, and I remember how close I came to answering a call that didn't come from a person, but from something pretending to be one. Story 8. The door that opened itself. It all began 5 years ago, around the time my youngest child had just turned 1. Life had settled into its usual rhythm: busy days, noisy afternoons, and those precious, quiet evenings when the kids were finally asleep and the house was still. But that calm didn't last long. One evening I was getting ready to carry my sleeping toddler from the couch to his bedroom. The hallway was dark. All the bedroom doors closed as usual. We kept them shut because my youngest had a habit of headbutting doors when they were left even slightly ajar. I gently picked him up and called out to my middle child, who was 3 at the time, to open the door for me. As I stood in the hall waiting, the bedroom door clicked and slowly swung open on its own, like someone on the other side had gently pushed it inward. I froze. I hadn't touched it. My son hadn't reached it yet. It just opened. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had nudged it earlier. Maybe a draft had moved it. But deep down, I knew something felt off. That door, like every other door in our house, stayed exactly where you left it. It didn't swing open freely. I dismissed it at the time, told myself I had imagined it, and when my son asked why I needed the door opened when it already was, I lied. I told him I forgot I had done it, but it lingered in my mind. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I tried to recreate what had happened. I cracked the door and stood in the same spot with my youngest in my arms. Nothing happened. I opened windows. I walked back and forth to test for airflow. Still nothing. The door didn't move. That single moment had no easy explanation. Things escalated slowly after that. Over the next few years, I saw and heard things that I couldn't share without sounding irrational. Soft knocks in the night, lights turning on by themselves, shadows flickering past doorways when no one else was home. I tried telling my husband, but he brushed it off every time. He needed things to be logical, explainable. So eventually I stopped trying to make him see what I was seeing. I stopped talking about the strange feelings that crept in when I was alone. I told myself I was just imagining things. That is, until the lamp turned on during movie night. My daughter had just returned from the kitchen, climbed onto the couch, and pulled her feet up when the corner lamp clicked to life on its own. The lights had been off for the movie, and I had turned that lamp off before heading to the shower. It wasn't a touch lamp. It was one of those crank ones. You had to turn the knob firmly for it to light up. My husband, always the skeptic, immediately assumed one of the kids had done it. He asked our middle child if he was behind the couch. But just as he asked, the boy walked in from the kitchen. He couldn't have turned the lamp on. My husband paused, the first hint of uncertainty crossing his face. He got up, went to the corner and checked the lamp, still warm from being off, still needing effort to turn on. Then, for the first time, he looked at me and said, "I think you were right about the ghost." It wasn't sarcasm. He was genuinely rattled. He even pulled up our security camera footage. We both watched the moment the lamp turned on, unprovoked, while our kids were accounted for in other parts of the house. After that, things changed. My husband didn't argue anymore when I told him I heard footsteps or voices. He stopped mocking my unease. But the activity started to ramp up. More lights flickering, more sounds at night, and more doors opening by themselves. The house felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. But the most disturbing part came when my youngest started talking about the figure in his bedroom. He'd point to corners of the room and say things like, "He's there again," or "He wants me to follow." At first I dismissed it as a child's imagination, but then he started describing the same dark shape I had seen in the hallway months earlier. A tall, thin shadow with no face, just a presence that seemed to watch rather than move. He wasn't scared, but I was, because I hadn't told him anything about what I had seen. I started sleeping with salt near the windows. I lit candles. I whispered protective prayers into the corners of each room. Some nights felt peaceful. Other nights were unbearable. I'd wake up from a dead sleep with the overwhelming feeling that someone was watching me from the hallway. My husband once jolted awake, convinced someone had whispered in his ear. He wouldn't talk about it afterward, just shook his head and muttered that he must have been dreaming, but we both knew it wasn't just dreams. Our home was no longer just ours. Something had moved in, and it wasn't trying to hide anymore. It wanted to be seen, acknowledged, and maybe more than anything, it wanted to stay. It had chosen us, or at least chosen our space, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to step fully into view. I never felt direct malice from it, but I didn't feel peace either. It wasn't a comforting presence, it was something ancient, something curious, like a visitor who had overstayed its welcome, but hadn't yet been asked to leave. I tried to research our house's history, but there was nothing unusual. No old deaths, no curses, no unsolved mysteries. The house wasn't old enough for that. But the land, it had a deeper history, one that predated the home, the streets, even the town. That knowledge made me feel more unsettled. What if what we were experiencing wasn't tied to the building, but to the ground itself? Something that couldn't be moved, couldn't be reasoned with, and wouldn't leave simply because we wanted it to. I started to wonder if other families who lived here before us had experienced the same. Maybe they moved not for space or jobs, but to escape whatever had followed them room to room, just out of sight. Now, years later, we still live here. The presence has quieted down, or maybe we've just grown used to it. Sometimes the lights still flicker, and every now and then that same bedroom door opens by itself. But we've learned to live with it. We don't challenge it. We don't invite it. And we certainly don't speak to it. I've taught my children to stay out of certain corners of the house, to treat the air with respect when it grows heavy, and to always close the bedroom doors before going to sleep. Because the moment you start letting something unknown open doors for you, you're also giving it permission to walk through. Story 9. The Forgotten Room. When my grandmother passed away, she left her old Victorian home to my father. It had been in the family for generations, standing tall at the edge of a quiet countryside road, surrounded by gnarled trees and overgrown hedges. It was the attic level, with a single door at the top of a narrow spiralling staircase, always locked and painted over. My father used to tell me that it was just storage, nothing worth seeing, but I always wondered why the lock was so new, so deliberate. When he inherited the house, he decided to renovate it and move us in. That's when we finally learned the truth about that forgotten room. The renovation crew had no idea what they were walking into. The contractor called one day to say they'd removed the old padlock and cracked open the third floor. What they found inside was unsettling. Not horrifying at first glance, but undeniably strange. The room was pristine, untouched by time. The walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper with tiny birds printed on it, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been used in decades. But the strangest part was the arrangement. A child's bed sat in the center of the room, flanked by two dolls seated in wooden chairs, facing each other. A rocking horse stood by the window, pointed inward, as though deliberately arranged. Dust hadn't even settled on the toys. One of the workers said it felt like someone had just left the room, even though it must have been sealed for at least 50 years. After that room was opened, things in the house started to shift. Doors would creak open on their own. Lights flickered even when the wiring had been freshly redone. My younger sister, who was only 6, began waking up in the middle of the night, saying she'd been playing with the girl from upstairs. We thought it was an imaginary friend. Kids make them up all the time. But then she started getting specific. She described the room we hadn't shown her. The rocking horse, the dolls, even the wallpaper with the tiny birds. My father and I exchanged looks the first time she said it. We never told her about that room. We had locked it up again just to be safe. But she spoke about it like she visited every night, like it welcomed her in. She wasn't afraid, but we were. One night, I heard footsteps upstairs long after everyone had gone to sleep. Slow, dragging footsteps that didn't match anyone in the house. They creaked across the ceiling above my room, stopped for a moment, and then resumed. I got up, heart racing, and tiptoed into the hallway. My sister was already standing there staring up the staircase. I whispered her name, but she didn't answer. She just pointed. "She's playing," she said. "She wants me to come back." I took her hand and brought her back to her room, locking the door behind us. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, listening to the soft tap of footsteps above us, as if someone paced in the third-floor room, waiting for company. The next morning, we told our father everything. He looked exhausted, like the night had weighed on him too. He admitted that when he was a child, he remembered hearing stories about the attic room, that it used to belong to his aunt, a little girl who passed away at the age of 7. The room was sealed afterward. No one talked about her and no one dared to step inside again. It had become a time capsule, a locked memory. He never knew how she died, only that something happened in that room, and it had never felt the same since. Hearing my sister talk about the girl made it all too real. We couldn't pretend anymore. The house was holding on to something it should have let go of long ago. We brought in someone who specialized in spiritual cleansings, Not a priest, but a soft-spoken woman who claimed she could sense residual energy. The moment she stepped into the house, she went still. "It doesn't want to leave," she whispered. "It doesn't know it's gone." She walked slowly through each room, lighting incense, murmuring prayers. When she reached the attic stairs, she stopped. "She's waiting for someone," she said. "She doesn't understand why everyone stopped playing." That line hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't anger we were dealing with. It was loneliness, a forgotten soul trapped in the room she had once loved, waiting for playtime that would never come again. After the cleansing, things quieted for a while. My sister stopped talking about the girl. The footsteps vanished. The house felt lighter, but I couldn't forget what we'd experienced. I couldn't shake the image of that room so perfectly preserved, untouched by time. We didn't lock the door again, but we left it alone. Covered the entrance, made it inaccessible, a respectful boundary. My father sometimes walks by the staircase and pauses, as if listening for something. I do too. There's no more sound, no more visits, but we still feel the presence in subtle ways. Like the weight of a memory just outside the edge of awareness, always there, always watching. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had left the room untouched, if we had never removed that lock. Would she have continued to wait, unaware that time had passed her by? Or was opening the door the only way to help her understand that she was no longer part of this world? I don't know. All I know is that the house feels different now. Not entirely empty, but quieter, like someone has finally found peace. And maybe, just maybe, that little girl isn't lonely anymore. Maybe she finally got the message that it was okay to stop waiting, that she can let go, that she's not forgotten, but she is free.